This is Athletes as Educators with former pro basketball player, championship winning coach, and author Angela R. Lewis. Angie Lewis interviews current and former athletes who are passionate about sharing the lessons they've learned and the experiences that have shaped their lives. A resource for parents, a guide for student athletes, a source for current and former athletes, keys to transition off the court. Welcome to the Athletes as Educators podcast with Angela R. Lewis.
Welcome to this episode. I am Angie Lewis, your host. On the podcast today, we have Sefu Bernard. He's a coach and executive by training. He's worked with the NBA, WNBA, Canada Basketball, and with the NHL, training athletes. Sefu, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Excited to be with you.
Would you talk about the lab and how you train athletes holistically?
The lab, I like to say, was the lab before everybody coined the term or reinvented the term. Now there's a million labs out there, but I started the lab in 2007 when I left pro sports. And it began, if somebody dug into the early posts, as a way. It wasn't about others. It was really about me having a place to articulate thoughts around coaching and player development. And the process of writing those posts helped me to better articulate what was going on, to wrestle with thoughts or let ideas percolate. And over time, as people stumbled across it, it became a great place for like-minded or greater-minded people to get together and exchange ideas on just that, the art and science of player development.
Talk a little bit about how you got to this point in your transition from working with pro sports.
It's been a fun ride. You know, I say it to people all the time, it's not everybody's path, but it's been my path, and I'm grateful for it. You know, I started my career as an intern in pro sports in the WNBA when Detroit had a franchise back in the 90s. And I've been able to, fortunately, segue that opportunity into a number of other different opportunities. And I like to think I haven't worked a day in my life, but, you know, my work is my passion. So it's what keeps me up late at night and wakes me up in the wee hours of the morning. I've been really blessed to have some good people speak into my life and give me advice, and fortunately, I'm still at it.
And why are you so passionate about helping athletes? I mean, beyond just the technical side of the game, but you deep dive.
For me, this is just the way I've been wired. You know, I think I've done those personality profile tests over the years, sometimes when applying for jobs, doing the psych tests, other times administering it for employees. And I think, you know, I just show up social. I just really care about people. So even as a coach, what I think other people might think is a deep dive is really just me being me. I'm you know, basketball is a tool, but at the end of the day, it's going to end. And what's left is the person. So if you're only teaching the technical, strategic, tactical, you're missing a huge part of who that person can be, both as a player by developing them mentally, socially, emotionally, but in the greater game of life, what happens to them beyond the sport when they can no longer dribble the ball, skate on ice, you know, whatever it may be, insert whatever sport you want. And so that's just my bent, you know. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, I have something owed. And so I have a beautiful burden of giving back to the others, and I just happen to enjoy it.
Yeah, that's phenomenal to be able to enjoy your work to that extent. And I'm sure you've talked to so many athletes over the years. What are some challenges that you see recurring with athletes over your career?
Sport specific or beyond?
Both.
I think the challenges that athletes experience at their core are not that much different than the challenges we all go through. Sport is their discipline. It's their craft. You know, insert being a teacher, a parent, a lawyer, whatever. Now, the stakes are different, and the lens under which they operate makes it different, especially when you're talking at the pinnacle of sport, whether it be the NBA, WNBA, NHL. So there are different factors. So I would be doing an athlete a disservice if to say, hey, you went through the same thing as, the average person. But really being able to navigate through that world is always tough. At its most basic, as a player, you might come to pro sports and you're coming from a collegiate program where you are the number one spot. You're the go-to. You're taking high volume of shots. You got the green light on everything, and then you move into pro sports, and all of a sudden you're not playing. You're not getting the shots. You don't know when your minutes are going to come. And so as an athlete, that's one of the big struggles that they have. And in many ways, their identity is caught up in their doing and how it's being perceived and how it's being analyzed by the powers that be. So to really navigate through that as they're transitioning into being a pro. And then the challenges change as you're in the middle of your career. And most, I think the one area that is not often talked about is at the latter stages of one's career. Whether you spend 2 years, 5 years, 10 years or beyond as a professional athlete, now as you try and navigate from being a professional athlete and operating in that space to the next thing. That one there is a really difficult one for most players and most people to navigate through. And so there's a lot of challenges there where players need support.
Let's keep talking about that a little bit more. I know that transitioning is difficult from being a professional athlete, as you mentioned. A few weeks ago, you attended an event, Pro to CEO, and you've done some work with the WNBA teams around helping athletes transition. What are some things that help athletes during that time?
The event that you touched on is run by somebody who I have a deep respect for. His name is Kevin Carr, and his brother's involved, and there's another individual too. They're really doing some great things to serve athletes, entertainers, entrepreneurs, and other high net worth people in this area of transitioning. And it was a great experience. I was fortunate. I'm working currently with the Washington Mystics in the WNBA. My primary responsibility is not transitioning, but again, it comes back to what my bent is. I don't think I'm doing my job in player development unless I'm influencing them beyond just being an athlete. But really, at its core, all credit goes to the players because I shared the opportunity with them. And it was really at an inconvenient time in our schedule, and they all raised their hands and showed up on their own. It was an optional event, so credit goes to them. In my past life in the NBA, I was manager of player programs and player development. And my primary responsibility in that role was not on court, it was off court, social, personal, and the professional development of the players. And so, almost like I touched on before, the big challenges are, a lot of them are identity related. To get players to understand that basketball, or whatever the sport is, it's not who they are, it's what they do. And then to go into that conversation is really difficult. Because to make it at that level, in many ways, I would say the lion's share of people have to create an identity. They self-identify with what they're doing, the performance. And it's difficult for many players to separate out those two, to separate out being the commitments and sacrifices that you have to make to make it at the highest level, yet still be present enough to be a dad, a mom, a spouse, somebody in the community who's giving back. It's really hard, whether you're at the beginning, the middle, or the end of your career, to leverage the opportunity beyond just being a player while you're in it is so hard for players. And the analogy that I use is, to me, sports is like the mafia.
Okay.
Whether you're playing it or you're in the business side of the game. When you're in, you're in.
Yeah.
And when you're out, you are out.
That
All
is
right?
very true. Yeah.
People don't answer your calls. You're in, people don't answer your calls. But when you're out, it was like you were never in the first place. And that's hard to deal with. And so I think, the biggest challenge as I've seen it is that most people, whether you're an athlete or an executive, they start too late. And you've got to be thinking about the quote unquote transition from day one while you're in it. And I recently heard it phrased at that Pro to CEO Success Summit that the transition to the second act starts during the first act. And I love that thought. It was a powerful one for me. And so the conversation I try and have with athletes when I'm going through this process is just saying, hey, transition is all about being able to think long term. And at the end of the day, it's all about digging your well before you're thirsty. We often just wait too long and too late.
Will you talk a little bit about a success story, a time when the process that an athlete went through and what was the outcome? Because and I ask that because oftentimes we hear about things that didn't work, where they had all this money, then they bombed out and they don't have anything now. Or, they're working somewhere that's way, way below their talent level. Rarely do we hear success stories.
It's an interesting question. And it's a great question because you're right. Your question reminds me of, when we talk about the media and how the media portrays different groups of people. And it's easy to point to the negative stories. The difficult thing, the thing that doesn't get done is to point to the success stories. The challenge with some of those success stories, they are often not sexy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly.
So I'm trying to think of your question. When I was with the Raptors years ago, man, we had some amazing guys, like just people. And forget what I thought of them as basketball players and their on-court accomplishments, but just great people. But the success rate, to answer your question, is not something that somebody's going to pick up and talk about. We had guys who were great dads, like phenomenal dads. How do you quantify that? And we had guys who were great spouses and husbands, but it wasn't that they were born into that. They worked at it. They sought out help and support and insight. We had one player who he understood over time that he needed to manage his money. I think of one player that I worked with, and it was a rookie contract, so he's not making big time NBA money. Mm-hmm. But literally in his first 2 years, he blew all his money. He was out of the league. He was playing overseas in fledgling leagues, and now all these years later, he's worked his way back into the league. He's been a starter on a different team and playing meaningful minutes at big moments. So on the surface, you'd say that's a success. But what's behind the curtain, is now he manages money well. He's very mindful of who's in his circle. And, credit for people like that goes to the individuals who are working at the team level in the NBA doing player development, the off-court development, guys like the Kevin Carr, the Chris Chins, those types of people who are supporting them, but people aren't talking about it. But those are really, to me, are the success stories.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And success oftentimes is framed as monetary and not necessarily personal, social, emotional, or even spiritual in what you do with your family and in your community. And so it's important that we reframe what success means and what it can look like.
Absolutely.
So throughout your career, you've worked all over the world. Will you talk some about where you've worked and the different roles that you've had?
Sure. I've been fortunate. I'm currently, home for me is the Cayman Islands, south, and I'm a Canadian, born and bred. I will always be proud of my country and my roots. I'm just not a big fan of the weather. So I guess deeper in there is my island roots. My family's from Jamaica, and so I'm attracted to warm weather places. But from a career standpoint, everything goes back to Canada. Working in pro sports, and you touched on that, but a real my foundation as a coach, a teacher coach, comes from my time with Canada basketball. The people there, the athletes and coaches that I've had a chance to work with, still to this day, have given me a perspective on the game that I don't think I could have gotten anywhere else. It's world class. And in my role with them, was fortunate to travel South America, the Argentinas of the world with our national team program. I was able to go to Europe and, Spain, Italy, Serbia, France, places like that to learn from other sharp minds in the game. Prior to coming back to the Cayman Islands, because I was here for a period and then left, I was working with the NBA in Asia as the senior director of basketball operations for the NBA over in Asia, which is a regional role. And that really rounded out my perspective on the business of sport, sport development, the impact of culture on how sport comes to life, because we had about 15 to 17 active countries in our territory, from East Asia, Japan, and Korea to Oceania, New Zealand, and Australia, to countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. And so one week I'd be in Japan, the next week I'd be in Korea, then I'd be down in the Philippines. And so, having all of those experiences really informed and shaped my perspective on the game and really how it comes to life.
Will you talk a little bit about the differences in how the game is played? Compare and contrast how the game is played in other parts of the world and to here?
Sure. I think there are two fundamental differences, in my opinion, that come to mind off the top. One of which is the rule set. The second of which is culture. Mm-hmm. So just to touch on, this is not a coaching forum, so I won't spend too much time on it. But in the U.S., plays with a different set of rules than pretty much every other country in the world. They play by FIBA international rules. And the big differences in there, the biggest difference, I think, in terms of how sport comes to life is in around the use of timeouts. Most sports have a timeout. And in basketball in the U.S., the timeout can be called from the coach at any given moment. They can call a timeout. FIBA international rules, that's not the case. The coach is still calling, in America, a coach or an athlete can call a timeout in live play. FIBA International, that timeout needs to come from the coach. It needs to go through the table, and it has to come at a stoppage of play at some interval. So the analogy I use to coaches in North America is, if you think of the NFL game, I don't know whose people's favorite team is, but think of the quarterback takes the snap, is dropping back, the defensive line rushes, and is about to sack the quarterback. And just at the moment that quarterback is about to be sacked, boom, a coach jumps and calls timeout and prevents the turnover. Mm-hmm. That's what happens in the U.S. in basketball games. And the problem with this is it takes away the decision-making moment. And so when you look at the rule set, that impacts player development, because you can't call a timeout to bail your players out of error. So you have to develop the player. And then the other one I touched on is culture. I think one of the things that I've gained perspective on in my travels is the impact that culture, both the cultural identity of the people in a country and how it impacts style of play, and the cultural perspective of sport in society and how it impacts participation, males versus females, aggressiveness versus passiveness, speed of play. All of these things come to the culture of the country. And so that's been my biggest learning is when you look, if you're going to do an analysis of why U.S. plays one way, Argentina, Serbia, China, and insert any other country, you got to understand the culture of the sport and the culture of the country to really understand. You can't just drop a coach in and say, hey, we're going to reinvent how this country plays. It just doesn't happen that way. And there's some great examples in basketball, in football or soccer, etc., for why it works and doesn't work.
Thank you for that overview. And it absolutely makes sense as to why the game is played very differently in different parts of the world. Through all of your experiences in various countries where you've gone in, what are some challenges that you faced in developing programs and our athletes?
Culture. Really, it is. I think back to my time in Asia specifically because I was, in the trenches on it. It wasn't just me being a fly on the wall as I had been in many other countries, just observing. Mm-hmm. So there are countries, for instance, in Asia where, for instance, it culturally, it's unattractive for girls to sweat, for girls to have musculature. In fact, the culture reveres a slender build and soft, supple skin and, all those things. So if you go into that country and you start to say to young girls, hey, let's go play. Let's go get a sweat. Let's talk about physical development. You're missing a key piece that you have to impact. You have to move another piece before you can get to that technical, physical piece. And that's the messaging. That's the narrative that runs far deeper than what you're trying to do in the sport. And so that changes wherever you go. Some countries, by way of an example, we enrolled out the first programming by the NBA in Vietnam ever. We had governmental obligations that we had to work through. We had introduced, we had something called our STAR values, sportsmanship, teamwork, positive attitude and respect, which from a Western standpoint, we're like, hey, these are universal. From their standpoint, they're like, wait a second, you're espousing values on our society? They weren't having part of that, so we had to have a conversation around that. So that's why it goes back to the culture. You gotta. It's too difficult for me to broad sweep when the differences can be quite significant based on the country within which you're operating.
Can you talk about a very memorable moment that you had, like one of your best moments throughout your work? I'm sure there are many. In regard to helping people learn about sport.
Yeah, I mean there are countless moments. There really are. There's been a lot of challenges along the way. My career hasn't been a smooth ride by any stretch, and it's so hard for me to pinpoint any one given moment because I spent a lot of time focused on gratitude. I have my moments of gratitude even with my 4-year-old before he goes to bed at night. We talk about, hey, what are you grateful for? So, that's the way I look. So I'm always finding those moments. But I think the firsts for me stand out. When I was an intern with Detroit Shock, walking down the hall as a kid growing up being a huge Detroit Pistons fan, and I'm seeing Isaiah and Joe D and Dennis on the wall. And then I got invited to play on the men's practice squad, and all of a sudden I was in the same facility as those greats. And then I was playing with the women, and then the coaches allowed me to be a part of the team and do scouts, and I was in the chalk talks, and for me, I'll never forget. There are other moments like I was just sharing with a woman I bumped into in Washington. They're doing a play. They're doing a play on 9/11. Mm-hmm. and talking about the experience in a place in Eastern Canada, Newfoundland. And a lot of people don't know about Newfoundland, but when 9/11 happened, not all, but most of the planes that were coming transatlantic were diverted to this small little place in Eastern Canada called Newfoundland. Two places, St. John's, Newfoundland, and Gander, Newfoundland. And so I had a happenstance meeting with her, but I was in St. John's, Newfoundland when 9/11 happened. And so there's a lot around 9/11, but the one thing that doesn't get a spotlight on was those people in that small remote community and how they embraced people of different cultures and backgrounds and faiths and religion, but that happened because of sport. So that for me is when I think of 9/11, the significance of that moment, I think of seeing humanity at its best in the way those people responded. Fed people, were human taxi drivers that kept their doors open. People were sleeping on the floor, on pool tables, giving up mattresses. It was remarkable. So that for me was a very profound moment. And then there were other ones. When I was in Asia working with the NBA, I was sitting across from, the commissioner and the deputy commissioner, and I'm pitching them on an idea with my colleagues. And I just remember sitting around looking at people who are cum laude and, from all these revered programs. And I'm like, me? Like, what am I doing here of all people? So I have fun moments like that, but hands down, it's above all else, the quiet moments behind the scenes, most times years after the fact when an athlete comes up to me and just says thank you, or I get a note out of the blue, thank you for something that I may not have remembered at times that I did maybe 5-10 years before, and it impacted in a way that I didn't realize at the time. That, above all else, is what I'll take with me to my deathbed, and that's what motivates me every day.
So there's no question that you are really passionate about it, and you have some amazing memories. What is one piece of advice that you have for young athletes and older athletes who are looking to their next step in their professional career?
I would go back to what I shared earlier. You got to dig your well before you're thirsty. You've got to do the work now for the unknown opportunity that will present itself later. The other one I would say is whether you're a young athlete or, older in college or, the space that I play now with professional athletes, I'd say you can be comfortable or outstanding, but not both. And I share it because it's something that I use for myself as well. And I'll leave it at that. As I do sometimes with athletes, I just kind of drop it and I walk away. But it's true. Because athletes, people, we gravitate towards that which is comfortable. But when you're existing in a place that's always comfortable, what I would say to people is there's a gap, especially for people who are high functioning or maybe that's the wrong word, but have big aspirations. When you're talking about competing at an NBA, a WNBA level with the best in the world, and then you throw out something like, hey, I want to win a championship. Those aren't idle words. Those come with actions and sacrifices and, understanding that what got you here is not going to get you there. Then you got to move into the crucial conversations. And so that's what I would say to athletes.
I love that. You could be comfortable or outstanding, but you can't be both. That is really good. That's really good. Thank you. I just want to thank you so much for joining me. If people want to learn more about you, want to get in contact, want to learn about transitioning, how can they reach you?
I'm all over the place. Sometimes maybe I'm spreading myself too thin. Twitter's a good way. I'm usually quicker on Twitter than I am on email because the email, my inbox gets full pretty quickly. So, hit me up on Twitter at Sefu Bernard is my Twitter handle. Most of my ramblings and thoughts can be found on my lab, in the lab. So the URL for that is thelab.com, but it's spelled THELLABB.com. You can think of B-ball written backwards, LLABB.com. And I continue to share there, not as much as I would like, given my other commitments, but I'm there, Facebook, whatever. I'm all over. I just most of the ideas are not mine. I just share them. So if somebody wants more, just hit me up and I can redirect you. Happy to do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sefu, and I look forward to learning more and talking to you more in the future.
The pleasure has been all mine, Angie. Thanks so much for the time. All the best.
This is Athletes as Educators.
Thank you for listening to the Athletes as Educators podcast. Connect with me through the Athletes as Educators Facebook page or at Athletes Educate on Instagram. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode, and go over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review. For more resources and information about today's podcast, you can check us out at AngelaRLewis.com.